and he will be giving us a presentation about professional communication. If anyone has any questions during it, please feel free to just pop it in the chat. And please give a warm welcome to Salvik, and please introduce yourself, and we'll get started with the presentation.
Sounds good. Well, hello, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Salvik. I work for the Pomerantz Career Center. And essentially my role on campus is to help you all figure out what it is you're going to do for the rest of your life. And I know that's like a super loaded question, but I'm basically a resource that is here to help you do those things. Even if you have a kind of like where you want to go, we've got tons of stuff too to kind of help prepare you for that, essentially. So, use me as a resource. I always like to kind of start that off with like the beginning of these presentations. I've done this now for a couple of years. And so some of you may have seen me, but I always do encourage you all to just follow up with me afterwards. Like that's my job, is to essentially help you. So you email me, you call me anytime you need me, and I'm happy to do whatever it is you need with whatever goals you have set out for yourself. I have a slide set that I've created that essentially kind of covers a lot of stuff. I think I was counting it up, and there's 31 slides. So I'm happy to make the slides available afterwards, because we're not going to spend a ton of time on like each and every single topic. We're just going to kind of use them as a guiding principle for what we're going to cover today. So I'm happy to make that available to you. Or if you want to talk more about something that you see on there, again, just let me know. I'm happy to help with whatever you may need. Okay. I will have the chat window open. So if you have questions throughout, feel free to drop it in the chat, or we can address those at the end. It doesn't matter. Thank you for the shout out, Susan. I love that. So yeah, let's go ahead and get started here. I'm going to do a screen share and do this, and let's get rolling. So hopefully what you are seeing is a slide set that says professional communication. So when I think about, professional communication, I kind of think about that in two different kind of subcategories. And I try to tailor this to the things that you all may be doing as University of Iowa students. So when I think about things that you all may be doing, I see it in these two big broad categories. The first category of telling your story and how you tell your story professionally, for the most part, is going to be through resumes and personal statements, and then communicating outwardly. So things like email etiquette, and then we'll talk about interviewing tips as well. So again, that's kind of the broad direction of where we're going to go. If you feel like there's things that you have questions about, again, throw it in the chat. We're also a small enough group too. So if you feel comfortable unmuting yourself, just interrupt me. Again, I'd rather have this be a conversation rather than me like clicking through slides, for 35, 40 minutes or however long, we go for, okay? So I want to start with just a conversation around resumes. So to kind of kick off this topic, do this for me in the chat, throw a number 1 through 5. So 5 being, I feel super confident in my resume. And then 1 being, I don't even know where to begin on my resume. So 1 to 5, throw it in the chat, and let's see kind of where we're at as a group. And this is a judgment-free zone. So if you put a 1, it's not going to bother me in the slightest. But 1 to 5 in the chat, throw that number in. 3, 2.5, 3, 5. Sweet. Excellent. Awesome. 3. Yeah. So if you were to ask me this question, I'll be completely honest, as a University of Iowa student, I probably would have told you -10. So you all are significantly farther ahead than I am. So I love seeing that in the chat. Really couple things though, when I think about a resume, it is truly a living, breathing document. This is something that you're going to update pretty much every semester. So if you feel like you're at a 3 now, the goal of this is to get things to look like it should, essentially. And then we're always going to be constantly updating it to make you that much more stronger of an applicant for whatever you may choose to use this document for. Now, to get you to that 4, the 5, and then 5+, these are just some general guidelines that I always run through, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Now, if you're thinking about a resume for graduate school, that's where you might see a resume that's a little bit longer, just because you have a lot more things to talk about in the academic side of things. But if you were applying for, let's say, a research position, a part-time job on campus, a job shadow experience, go ahead and use that format of a 1-page resume. Now, with that 1-page resume, a couple of tidbits, 10 to 12 point font, and then your inch margins, 0.5 to 1.0. And the big reason for this is, let's say we were to print out your resume. If your resume font is smaller than a 10-point font, I mean, that's when we're really like squinting our eyes and trying to like really get an idea of, okay, what does this resume actually look like and what does it say? So if you find yourself in that like 10 to 12 point font, that's the sweet spot. The margins, same deal. Essentially, if you go smaller than a 0.5 margin and you hit print on your resume, it's going to start chopping things off because most printers can only handle 0.5 margins. Okay, so those are the two that I always start with because, you know, let's say your resume has a lot of really, really good stuff on it, but if you don't have it formatted correctly, you run the risk of things not being seen because something gets cut off or it's too small of a font or it's too large of a font. So double check your resumes and make sure you're in that 10 to 12 and that 0.5 to 1 inch margins. The last thing that I'll kind of share with you all here is to double check that you always proofread and spell check your resume. And I'm super guilty of this. I am probably like one of the worst like writers you'll ever see. I can't edit a paper to save my life. But on my resume, I am 100% confident that there's no spelling errors, that there's no grammar errors, because I spent a lot of time with that. And the reason why I want you to do that is I've seen this happen to students is that let's say you're applying for a super detail-oriented position, and then all of a sudden you spell experience wrong. And so it throws your application out completely because if you're applying for a detail-oriented position and you have, you know, a spelling mistake, then it kind of starts to elude like, okay, how detail-oriented are you actually? So always double check and proofread your resume. Find someone in your friend group or in your network that's a great editor. Another example or another way to do this is to just take it to the writing center and have them take a look at some grammar and some writing spelling stuff. So just always do that double check. Those are probably my three keys to writing and having an effective resume is the font size, the margin, and for sure, make sure you spell check and proofread that resume. Now, in terms of the other half of the battle is essentially starting to think about like, okay, what actually goes on your resume? So these are just some possible experience sections that you can have. And I always like having these section headers. I actually looked at a resume today that basically just had the education section at the top. And then it said work experience. And it was literally everything that they've ever done was categorized in that one section. Now, again, think about it in the terms of scannability. If I was an employer or a graduate school that was looking for something that was super specific, but everything was categorized around work experience, there's odds are that things aren't going to be looked at. So be really strategic with like how you use these section headers. And the best way to even start thinking about like how to use a section header is just to get an idea of your lay of the land. You know, before you even think about these, literally type out everything that you've done so far at the University of Iowa, and then start to see if there are themes that emerge. So maybe you have 2 part-time jobs, a leadership experience, and you're in a student organization. Then you can kind of start to categorize those things around work experience, leadership experience, college activities. And so again, that's probably where you would first start is just write them all out and see where they're at, and then start to categorize and look for themes to start having a good idea of how to lay things out. Now, in all reality, and when I think about like how your section headers are probably going to look, the education section, that's going to be the first section on every single person's resume. As you get older, that education section tends to move farther down the resume. Like if you were to take a look at my resume, my education section is the last thing that's listed because there are more relevant things that I have done towards the top. But for all of you, education, that's the #1 section. And then we categorize them based on relevancy to what you are doing. So let's say, for example, you are applying to a research assistant position on campus. Then we want to make sure that we talk about things that are research related and have those at the top. So think of those sections as that like the fluid piece of your resume. We're going to move those things around depending on what we are doing essentially as students on campus. These are just another like sample of those of other things that you may take a look at if you're thinking about common healthcare experiences. So again, before you even think about like what section headers you should use, start with just making a list of everything you've ever done, and then start to see if there are areas that we can start categorizing your experiences into. Now, having all the section headers, like that's important, but probably what's even more important than that is actually what you put within those bullet points. So this is just a sample of what a bullet point or an effective bullet point looks like, but this is your opportunity to tell your story. And when I think about writing effective bullet points, I see this as like the other half of the battle, which I think is a little bit harder of how do you write an effective bullet point? And I think it's this slide. This is probably one of my favorite slides in this entire presentation because you can kind of see a before and after bullet point at the bottom in that little graphic that's there. I see this a ton where someone's bullet point will say, I made a documentary. It's like, great. There's a lot more that you can say though about that. Like, what's the documentary? How did you do it? And then why did you film it? And so when I think about like writing these effective bullet points, follow this as a guide that you start your bullet point with a power verb or some sort of skill, And then what did you do, or what was your job duty? And then the results and purpose, or the how and the why. This is again where it just takes some practice. So if I had to bet, I would say that a lot of you that put in like the 2, the 3, the 4, I'm assuming that's probably where that hesitation is to say that you're at a 5, is what you're putting down in terms of content. And that's something that we can help you with as a career center. So if you feel like you're kind of stuck, or like, how do I actually, make this a stronger bullet point? Use this as kind of like a starting point to just say like, okay, this is kind of what I want my resume bullet points to look like, and then take it to that next level from this point. But again, I'll make these slides available. So this, I think, is probably like the one that I would earmark. If you feel like you're not where you want to be with your resume, take a look at this slide and see if we can kind of craft out some really strong bullet points. Okay. This is just kind of another example of this, of just like what a bullet point that I see on resumes all the time, and then a way for us to take it to that next level. So again, just more examples and more ideas of how you can really start to strengthen out your bullet points. Again, this takes a little bit of, arts and crafts, I like to say, to really feel like you're, really solid with the content that you have presented on these resumes. Other like miscellaneous reminders that I like to point out here. It's going to feel really goofy, but we're basically going to organize your resume on reverse chronological order. So that basically means that your most recent activity is going to be at the top of your resume section, and then reverse chronological order from there. Don't worry about periods. These are all going to be bullet points. So, you don't have to worry about having like that piece of grammar on there. Just make sure you have those bullet points. And then I see this as well, so I like to include this, is some of you, if you choose to have a skills section, make sure you only list your hard or technical skills in that section. So the example that I like to use here is on my resume, I have a skills section. And in my skills section, I have things that are technical. So things like I am a proficient in Adobe Premiere Pro. I am trilingual, so I have that on my resume. Things that I don't want you to have on a skills section is things like communication skills or leadership skills or positivity. Those are essentially going to be bullet points that you can work into your content. So again, I always like to just kind of make sure I mention that, because that's a huge, like, we'll say faux pas. I guess it's a big faux pas, is to have like those soft skills in the skills section. Only things that are going to be technical and skills I want you to put in that section. But again, these are just some like random, like miscellaneous reminders and things that I just want you to be aware of as you're putting your, finishing touches on your resume. But I would rather you all spend that time on the content. Question in the chat here about high school information. So essentially, to include high school information, it depends on kind of where you're at your University of Iowa journey. If you are a second, third, fourth, 4+ year student here on campus, I would say pull off your high school information. You do not need it anymore. If you are like an entering first year student that hasn't had the time to like acclimate to campus and gain some experiences on campus, I would say then high school is okay. But for right now, with kind of where you're at, it's kind of like that self-reflection of, okay, what do I have that can I put on my resume? The one that I'm going to back up to here is, I'd like to show this one. So this is the bullet point that I like having on resumes, especially if you find yourself like, struggling to fill in like the white space because you're just new here on campus, you're just trying to get the lay of the land, is to utilize things that you've done in classes and talk about those things on your resume. So one example here is going to be course highlights, where you essentially can kind of list out some relevant courses that you've taken, especially if you're on like the health sciences track. Throw on those classes. Tell us that you're in principles of chem or bio or physics or whatever you're taking, or talk about class projects. If you've done like a research, you have a research experience that you did in a class, you can use that as a class project experience. So yeah, if you find yourself like wanting some more stuff on your resume, that's a great like spot to include that. So that way you don't feel like there's nothing on there. I really, no matter kind of where you're at, I always like to have a class project or course highlight section, just to kind of showcase that you are, an academically minded student and you've got some of those things available to you as well. Okay. That's essentially the resume section. Again, feel free to kind of throw things in the chat as you think of them. I wanted to briefly kind of touch on the personal statement as well, because I know some of you have grad school aspirations, which is awesome. And if you're thinking about applying to graduate school, you're going to need a personal statement in some capacity. And essentially, the way that I like to start thinking about personal statements, I'm going to pause here. A lot of text. Again, this will be available to you. So when I think about personal statements, I think the first like step is to truly just embrace the process. It's an opportunity for you to tell people your personal story and your narrative, and then also to reflect upon the things that you have done. And especially if you're thinking about healthcare related graduate programs, it's an opportunity to think about like taking care of others. Okay. This bullet point is specific to those of you that might be thinking medical school is in your future. And that is essentially looking at that 5,300 characters. That 5,300 characters, that's going to be the character count essentially that you have on your personal statement. You can't go over it. If you go over it, it basically cuts off everything you have after 5,300. That is just an example. Now, every graduate program will have a different character count limit. So as an example, like if some of you may be thinking that you want to go off into dentistry, dentistry has like a 4,700 character count. Physical therapy, they have a different character count. Athletic training, they have a different character count. So again, this one is kind of that bullet point is specific to medical school, but just do that double check and make sure that that character count and that all of your stuff is within the limit that you have available to you. The last piece that I have when it comes to just writing personal statements is to give yourself as much time as possible to write this thing. It takes a lot of practice to kind of figure out like what experiences are you going to talk about? What's the narrative going to be? How do you get it all to flow together? And then proofreading and spell checking and all that stuff, it just takes a lot of time. So the sooner you can get started on this stuff, the better and the easier it's going to be. And I think everyone has a different like writing style. I know for me, when I think about like the papers that I've written for class when I was a student, I always outlined everything and then that helped me kind of stay on track. So if you are thinking about like those classes that you've taken, whatever process you used as to write those papers, use that same exact process to create this personal statement. Okay. And really, when I think about like these personal statements, it all is going to start with some sort of narrative, right? So that first paragraph of that personal statement, again, regardless of what graduate school you go to, you're going to want to hook a reader in. And the way that you do that is essentially you basically tell them a story. What was that light bulb moment that said, I want to go into medicine, or I want to be a physical therapist, or I want to be an athletic trainer? What was that moment? And kind of using that first paragraph to tell that story and again, grab a reader's attention. From that point, we then kind of build out your body paragraphs. But the thing that I always bring up here is make sure that your narrative is going to be super authentic to who you are. Like, don't write a narrative paragraph that you think people want to read. One of my favorite personal statements that I read actually started off with a student who was applying to dentistry school. She started talking about how she used to volunteer her time at a nursing home. And she went to the nursing home and she played her ukulele. Has nothing to do with dentistry, but she was then able to kind of tie in like the why was essentially that her ultimate goal was to go into geriatric dental care. And she talked about how playing the ukulele helped work on her manual dexterity skills, and that she was around old people, or basically people that she would want to work with as a dentist. And so again, don't write a narrative paragraph that you think is what people want to read. Write one that is super authentic to you and truly is your light bulb moment of why you want to do the things that you want to do. I think the narrative paragraph sometimes can be the most challenging. The other question that I usually get with narrative paragraphs is, does it have to start with a challenge or a challenge of overcoming or something along those lines? And the answer to that question is no, it does not. And so really don't feel like it has to be this like super like magical thing that you did or whatever. Again, I think it's truly all about what was that light bulb moment of why you wanted to go into medicine or healthcare or whatever, and we tie your entire story around that. Okay? But sometimes I like to think to save the narrative for last and actually start with the experience paragraphs first, because for the most part, your experience paragraphs, they're not going to change all that much depending on kind of how you choose to structure your personal statement. But same deal with this. I like to think about before you even write your experience paragraphs, take a step back and think about what are all the things that you've done during your undergraduate journey and start to think about which ones of those do you consider are your key experiences. Like which ones of those were like the ones where you felt like you were the most connected, the journey that you wanted to go on. Okay? Once you figure out like what those key experiences are, the next step of that is to, again, think about creating a narrative hook. So within that body paragraph even, is there a story that you can share that again, kind of drilled into the fact of what you wanted to do is the path that you want to go down. And the example that I like to throw on here is one that is maybe common depending on what your experiences look like. But it was a student that was applying to med school a few years back, and he was talking about his experience working as a CNA. And that CNA experience, basically, I don't know if some of you are CNAs, but you are literally like, you are the patient's person. Like you are in that room more than anyone else is, and you really do get to know those patients. And so he talked a lot about how he learned what effective patient care looks like by working as a CNA, by being there and helping the patient understand, like, what's the diagnosis, what's the prognosis going to be, how do we get them better, essentially. And so he took that CNA experience. So that experience paragraph was, I was a CNA at the University of Iowa Hospitals and Clinics. One experience that really stands out to me about how I learned about how to treat people is by this paragraph, essentially told like in a few sentences. He set the scene, what was happening, what was he doing, and then most importantly, the things that you want to do with your body paragraphs are these last two bullet points. You want to talk about how that experience has affected you, and then how has that experience influenced your decision to pursue medicine or healthcare, or insert your potential career path in there. I think that these body paragraphs are in the realm of about 8 to 9 sentences long by following that format. Tell us what you did, tell us how you were doing that with that story, and then ultimately connect it into your why statement. Why are you going into medicine? Why are you doing the things that you are doing throughout that journey? Okay. Experience paragraphs, I think, are really going to be your bread and butter. Like when I think about those 5,300 characters, I would probably imagine that like 4,800-ish ballpark, give or take a couple, are going to be your body paragraphs. And then the rest of them will be your narrative and then your conclusion. Essentially, your conclusion paragraph is just like any other conclusion paragraph for any other paper that you have written. It's ultimately just a way for you to showcase your positive qualities and then the perspectives that you gain from all the experiences above, and then ultimately answering your passion for medicine. The one thing that I like to always do too on the conclusion paragraph is like connect things back to your narrative. So like if you talked about in your narrative that, you know, your interest in healthcare stemmed from the care that you received from a physician or whatever the case may have been, then it's kind of tying it all back together by talking about that same thing in your conclusion paragraph. So in your conclusion, then you talk about, hey, I want to be a physician that took care of me like X, Y, and Z things. And so it's just a nice way to kind of tie the knot at the end of your personal statement. But essentially, that's going to be like the bare bones of what your personal statement can look like. These are just some like, just like with our resume tips, these are just some like miscellaneous things that I want you to be aware of things that you just want to kind of put in your back pocket. So again, make sure that you proofread that resume as many times as you can. Have, again, a friend proofread it, a mentor proofread it, someone who's really, really good at grammar, have them take a look at it. It's, again, just like that fail safe of making sure things are spelled right and commas are where they need to be. The other thing that I like to do is to also have someone who has no idea who you are, have them read it. I personally love doing this because this is just a great way to see if your story is coming across. Have them read your personal statement and then essentially see, can they tell you what your key experiences were? Can they tell you why you want to do the things that you want to do? If they can't do that, then sometimes it's like, maybe we need to think about how we write these body paragraphs or your experiences out some more. It's a little bit harder to have like a parent, let's say, or a friend proofread it sometimes because they just know you so well that they have a little bit of that bias that comes along with that. So just finding someone who has no idea who you are, have them take a look at your personal statement and see, can they kind of pick up the same kinds of themes along the way. The last thing that's on this slide that I want to touch on is that YouTube video that's at the bottom, that link. That link will go to a video that was created in conjunction with the Carver College of Medicine admissions team. And essentially, it's a whole video that's devoted to writing personal statements. So if you feel like you need somewhere to start and just kind of get an idea of like what a personal statement could look like, just follow that YouTube link when these slides come out to you. And it's a great kind of starting point of getting an idea of like, okay, what can I write about? How can I start thinking about my personal statement? Okay. That's essentially kind of like that last little piece of like, how do you communicate, like have communication materials, resumes, and personal statements. I'll pause there for a second. If anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat or unmute yourself before we shift gears and we talk about emails and interview etiquette. Any questions along the way? Cool. All right. Let's go into communication with others. And essentially, the first thing that I wanted to talk about is email etiquette. I'm not going to talk about absolutely everything that's on this email or that's on this slide because I'm assuming some of you have kind of have heard of this at some point before in your journey. The one thing that I always kind of bring up with emails is just always to consider your audience. So there are times where, like, I'll use Susan as an example. Like Susan and I got to know each other really well throughout her journey at Iowa. I would say that like our emails back and forth probably weren't always like the most like, hey, dear Susan, how was your day? And so it doesn't always follow the email kind of etiquette. But like if Susan had no idea who I was, you always kind of want to fall towards the air of passion and write a super professional email, but always just be considering your audience of like what your email looks like. I'll give you this as another example. Like when I email my colleagues, especially some of like my work besties, like there's like images, there's GIFs, there's memes. And so like those emails again look very different than the ones that I send to my boss, right? So always consider your audience before you draft your email. The other thing that I like to kind of throw out there too with your email etiquette is to have a signature. And that signature is essentially like the block that's at the bottom of an email that has your name like bolded, and then it has like what your major is, and then any like relevant experiences or like relevant titles that you might be using when you send out your emails. It's just a nice, clean, clear way for the people that are reading your emails to know exactly who you are and why you might be emailing them. Okay, so those are going to be like my two big things when it comes to email, other than what you see up here on the slide, is always consider your audience and then think about having an email signature if you don't have one already. Now, with these emails, this is just like an example of this is an email that I've gotten as an instructor at the university. When I get this email, I think to myself, there's a lot of things wrong with this, and you all might be able to see that as well. As an instructor, when I see an email come through like that in my inbox, I'm like, do I really need to respond to Jim right away? It doesn't really seem like Jim is all that, interested in getting this email or getting a response. And so really when I think about just like emailing a faculty member or just emailing anyone in general, follow these email etiquette tips and take this same exact email and make it look something along the lines like this. So, again, giving that context, using proper grammar, and just kind of following that proper email etiquette. Again, as an instructor, as a faculty member on campus, when I see an email like this, I am more likely to respond a lot quicker because I know that in this situation, the student spent some time thinking about this, so I better get back to them as fast as I can. So again, you can use this as a guide. Again, I'm assuming based on kind of where you all are at with your journey, that your emails probably look more like this. It's okay if it looks like this for right now, but let's work on moving towards this kind of email and this kind of structure. Okay. And I will also say that, like, when I think about just emails in general, we all get a bajillion of them, right? Like, I'm willing to bet that the hour that we've spent together right now, if you were to open up your emails, you probably have like 40 emails that are sitting in there. So, again, when I think about just like, how do I write a non annoying email? These are like the 10 steps that I like to utilize. Again, they're kind of like jokey 10 steps, but sometimes I think like they're kind of serious, right? Like I love when someone just says like, hey, dear, and then using like a professional title, especially when it's some of your professors that worked extremely hard on a doctorate, use that title, use professor, use doctor. And then the line that recognizes like our common humanity, like, hey, did you survive the tornadoes that are coming tomorrow afternoon or whatever, And so just a way to kind of like, hey, I'm not jumping right into the content. I'm recognizing that we're in this stuff together. And then writing a really concise email essentially is then going to be like 3 to 4 sentences, which you see here, and then signing off with that email signature. Okay. Again, you can kind of put this in the back pocket as you write your emails and thinking about this as a template or as a guide as you as you fire off all those emails. The last little bit here that I'll talk about is interviews. And this is going to kind of cover any and all interviews, both graduate school, but also like employment interviews. And so when I think about just interviews in general, I think the biggest part of this process is just going to be making sure that you spend time and that you prepare for the interview. And there's a lot of different things that you can do to prepare for interviews. And this is just a sample list of those potential things. The one thing that I always make sure to mention is when I think about like interviewing, it's not as much spending time thinking about like what they may ask you. It's spending more time thinking about like what have you done and where do those potential experiences fit different questions, okay? So like, for example, like a common question that everyone's going to ask you at some point is, what's a challenge that you've overcome? Tell me about it. And then it's thinking, okay, what experience truly fits that the best? And then once I use that experience to tell that story or answer that question, are there other experiences that I could use? So I'm not always pulling from the same source to answer those same questions. Because if you think about like what's on your resume, you want it to be able to let each of those activities shine. So really review your resume and reflect on the experiences and see if you can predict what kinds of questions they may be asking and what kinds of experiences are you going to use for those different questions. Okay. The last little bit here that I have on the prepare is really just to map the route. I think about this like more times than not is to give yourself enough time to go and get to the location that you're trying to get to. And I sometimes take it all the way to the extreme, right? Like I sometimes, like when I go to work, as an example, like I'm usually at work in like a t-shirt and like a pair of jeans, nothing really all that formal, right? But when I go to an interview, I'm probably wearing like a dress shirt and a tie and wearing a suit. Like that, I know it sounds really silly, but like doing that takes like a whole additional 10 minutes for me to get ready. So, and that's 10 minutes that I may not be thinking about that I have because I'm in my like normal routine. So truly play that whole scenario out. Spend some time putting on your stuff and getting to the location and seeing how long that takes you, and make sure that you plan to arrive early and build that into your preparation for the interview. These are just some common questions that you might find in these interviews. This little tell me about yourself, this is linked to our website. That is a whole video about how to answer that interview question. So there is a ton of interview resources that you can find on our Pomerantz Career Center webpage. But if you were to think about like, what are some common questions they're going to ask me? These are the common questions that they're going to get asked at these interviews. So again, you have access to this, but if you were to go onto our PCC webpage, or sorry, Career Center webpage, you search interview tips, you'll be able to find a full list of sample interview questions that you can use to practice. These are just some other little tips that I like to talk about too when it comes to just like, how do I prepare for my interview? So it's always thinking about too that this is an opportunity for you to get to know them as well. You get to understand what are questions that you have about the role, about the office, about what you're going to be joining. So always have some questions prepared for them too. So you can pretty much bank on them asking like, hey, what questions do you have for us? Having some of those questions poised and ready to go is always going to be something that's going to suit you as well. So having those ready to go, and then that's the link right there, careers.uiowa.edu/interview. That's where you can find a whole bunch of resources too about interview questions that you're going to get asked, but also questions that you can ask the interviewers as well. The last little bit here is also kind of shifting the focus a little bit to thinking about interviewing for graduate school, since I know a lot of you that's on your mind. And so when you think about graduate school interviews, they're going to look a little bit different than like a traditional job interview. You can pretty much bank on being there for like an extended period of time. Like I'm talking 4 to 6 hours at minimum sometimes. And so I always start with like interview the day, right? Like figure out like what's the day going to look like? What are you going to get asked in different situations? And just spend as much time as you can creeping around and just getting an idea of like, what is my 4-hour interview block going to look like? Once you have an idea of like what your interview day looks like, then spend some time researching the institution. Figure out what is it that interests you about the institution? Is it program? Is it the faculty members that are there? Because they are going to ask you, why do you want to come to the Carver College of Medicine? And you want to make sure that you're giving a solid answer to that and showcasing that you have genuine interest because you spent time researching the University of Iowa College of Medicine's webpage. The other piece too, it's kind of the same thing with your resume, but this time consider the rest of your application materials. For graduate school, most likely you're going to have a resume or a CV that's getting submitted, a personal statement, a research statement, potentially, depending on what kinds of programs you're looking at, an activities list. I mean, it goes on and on and on. So it's really just taking a moment and just getting an idea of like, okay, what did I talk about in all of these materials? And then how can I utilize these materials, again, to fill in and answer certain kinds of questions? But really, I think about like, what is the key to get through a graduate school interview? I think it's truly that first one. I think nothing causes you more anxiety than like, what is my interview actually going to look like? So if we can figure out like what the interview day looks like well in advance, it's going to really help alleviate some of those things and help you prepare based on what you find from your findings. Okay. These are just some other interview resources that we have available. Big Interview is an online video resource that we have. Big Interview is basically an opportunity for you to get questions right at your computer, and it records you giving the answer. At the end of the interview, it sends you a video file, and that video file is a way for you to then send out to your network and basically get feedback from different individuals. Mock interviews are also an excellent way to prepare for interviews. Our Career Center, we host mock interviews that are led by real employers. So as an example, I don't know if anyone has like seen some of the marketing that's gone out from our office, but we had the CIA in our office for the last couple of days here, and they were doing mock interviews. And so they were asking like mock interview questions that like the CIA asked, which is like kind of creepy because the entire time I was like, are you a spy? But you can figure that out later. But really just taking a look to see like what kinds of interview tips are out there. And then the last one that I forgot to link, but you can find that on our website, is a video that we created, again, with the College of Medicine admissions team. So me and Amy, we talked about all the different interview tips that we have for medical school applicants at Carver, and it was done in a video format. So that is available to you as well on our website. So again, if you want to have an idea of like, what does Carver interviewing look like? That's a video that you have access to here on campus. That is ultimately the entire slide set. I know that is a lot of content. I told you there's 31 slides, but that is my email address right there at the bottom. I will also drop it in the chat as well. Again, I would highly encourage you all, as you go through this journey, if you ever need anything, if you need help getting unstuck with whatever it is that you're doing, just send me an email and we can set up a time and we can chat, whether that's on Zoom, in person, over the phone, literally whatever you need. Just send me an email. I'm happy to be an advocate for each and every single one of you. Whatever you need, I'm in your corner, okay? That's essentially the presentation. That's the session. I got a little bit of time for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or drop it in the chat, or obviously just send me an email too. That works as well. But thank you all for your time and hanging out with me. That's all I got. Amy, Susan, I don't know how you want to deal with the rest of this, but the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Savik. Do we have any quick questions for Savik to end this off before we finish our evening? I don't want to keep Savik for too long past his next commitment, but if anybody has any questions right off the bat that they'd like to ask, now would be the time. I had one, and I know the answer to the question, but I want everyone else to know the answer to the question.
All right, hit me.
So with interviews, you have so much to talk about and you want to get everything out there that's in your mind, but do you have to try and talk about everything about you in an interview, like all of your experiences, your story, just like, should you be trying to fit every single last detail into the interview?
Yeah, you should not. No, so I think like that's truly where I like to think about, regardless of like what interview you go through, whether that's like an employment or graduate school interview, really create yourself that list. Talk about, what are all the experiences that you've had, and then think about a key story from each of those experiences. Because again, we can pretty much bank on the kinds of questions they're going to ask us. And so we can then, if we kind of spend some time looking at each experience and then a specific story that came from that experience, we can then work in those stories into different kinds of interview questions. Now, too, also remember, like when you have these interviews, it's just one component, right? Like you're going to have all the other pieces that are out there. So you don't have to use and tell them absolutely everything about you. Just really think about what are those key things that you want to talk about in an interview. What are the things that gets you excited about those experiences? Because if you can show that excitement, if you can show that passion, that's all going to help you long-term too.
Thank you, Savik. Any other questions from the audience? If not, everybody have a great rest of your weekend. And thank you so much again, Savik. We really appreciate you coming to MAPS.
Yeah, no problem at all. Again, send me an email if you have any questions, but I'll see everyone later. Okay, take care.
Bye, you too.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.